Ah. Okay. Yeah. Bienvenue, welcome here in the European Parliament. Lester Brown, one of his specialities is to come once a year to Brussels. And he's doing it since 20 years. And he's not like most of us, he's only happy when he can write one book a year, which is then translated, as you've read in the invitation, into a lot of languages. Those of you who don't know Lester Brown, he's a little bit special. There are a lot of us here now who are interested in environment, local environment, national environment, continental environmental question, but the only one worldwide who started to look on environment from a global perspective is Lester Brown. And when you look on the environmental discussion in a lot of countries and a lot of continents, he contributed heavily to bring new issues on the agenda. And those of you who were here already last year might remember that he mentioned a lot of issues which finally developed to his new book, which some of you have bought already. It's there at the door. You can acquire it. And if you would like afterwards to have a signature of Lester, he's doing it. And if you like a photo, he's signing you. We have a photographer here as well who knows his task is as well, when the book is signed and you smile at the photographer and at Lester, then you get a photo as well. But you're not here to listen neither to me, nor to the two MEPs here, but on Lester, and Lester is just writing down all the important things he will share with us. Therefore, I give shortly now the floor to Martin Häusling and to Nikos Chrysogelos. It's like with the Rolling Stones. You have groups who are playing in front. Now it's Martin Häusling. Yeah.
Yes, colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I think Lester Brown is coming at the right moment. We now discussed in the Parliament the new common agriculture policy for the next years between 2014 and 2020. And the European Commission decided to change its energy policy concerning agrofuels. Food scarcity, as Lester describes, is driven by falling groundwater tables, eroding soils, rising temperatures, and decreasing harvest. Since land resources are becoming scarcer and food prices increase, controlling arable land and water resources become a more and more central issue for food security. Worldwide, this leads to more and more land and water grabbing and expulsion of small farmers and pastoralists who often don't hold land titles. At the same time, large percentage of our grain and soya harvest is concerned to meat in order to feed the world's growing middle classes who are moving up the food chain. In Europe, we import 40 million tons of protein each year. That means 20 million hectare arable land in South America. As draftsman on the European Parliament's report on the EU protein deficit, I took up these issues with regard to the inefficiency of our food production, considering the world food security. We absolutely have to change meat consumption and to rebalance the supply of consumption of cereals, proteins, and oilseeds in the EU and worldwide. Beyond that, crop rotation with legumes could have major economic benefits for farmers, soil conservation and soil restoration, water conservation and biodiversity. It would also contribute to more effective use of our natural resources, such as energy and phosphates. So, these are only a few points of our discussion in the Parliament, and we are very interested to hear what Mr. Lester Brown is now presenting to us. And we hope we have a good discussion, and we need this discussion in the European Parliament, and we, as Greens, hope we can help to bring further this debate for better agriculture and for a better world for all people. And we have a lot of problems in agriculture and to feed in 20 years 9 billion people.
Okay, this was the champion of the fight against land grabbing, and now, since Jesus Christ, Confucius, Mao Zedong, for the first time that a Greek was elected to the European Parliament from the Greens. Never before in this European Parliament, before this legislature, there were Greens in the Parliament. It's now Nikos, please.
Thanks a lot, Frank. You know very well the work of Lester Brown, but we are here to discuss. We are here for the European presentation of his book, Full Planet, Empty Plates. It's very strange but excited title. But when we start reading the book, it starts like this. The temperature was rising, but the rain was not falling. The combination of record or near record temperatures and low rainfall was drying out soils. And suddenly you see the subtitle and speaks about new politics of food scarcity. It's very interesting because then there is a connection of food with security issues, and someone who doesn't know well your work is wondering what could be the relationship between food and security. Why is so crucial and so important food security, and how the water issues, the climate issues influence security problems. And I will try to be very brief. I will follow what Frank told. Some weeks ago, there was a demonstration that arrived here about good food and good agriculture. 2 days, yesterday and today, there was a demonstration of farmers outside here. And today, on 6:30, started an event at Zero Floor, prepared by wine producers of Creta. So I'm very curious to hear about the connection of these different activities with security issues. So, the floor is yours.
Finally, it's you. Come on.
Some months ago, I was in Colorado and was talking with former Governor Bill Ritter, R-I-T-T-E-R, obviously I think of German ancestry, but he was telling me about an experience he had in public speaking where he'd been invited to speak someplace, and the entrance was not in the front but in the back, and he came in the back door, and there was one person there sitting on the front row, just one person. So he started to turn around and leave, but then he said, well, I've driven all the way here, and at least this guy wants to hear me. So he went up, and he gave his talk to the guy on the front row. And then he was finishing, and he had folded his things up and started to leave. And he was headed for the door, and the guy on the front row said, wait a minute, where are you going? He said, well, I finished my talk, I'm heading home. And the guy said, but I'm the next speaker. Well, thankfully, our front row is full tonight. I'd like to talk about the global trends that are affecting food security. My own sense is, in looking at the world today, at our modern civilization, if you will, is it loud enough?
Is it loud enough? And if it's not loud enough, put the earphone on, then you can hear it. The theme of the book, Full Planet, Empty Plates, is that we are in transition
from an era dominated by food surpluses, the last half of the last century, to one that's going to be dominated by scarcity. This year we saw in the United States record drought and a drop in not only the U.S. Grain harvest, but as a result, the world grain harvest dropped this year some 78 million tons, or about 4% from last year. So things have gotten tighter. We've seen corn and soybean prices set all-time highs back in August as the situation has tightened. And we asked, one of the questions I ask in the book is, who is affected by the doubling of world wheat prices, for example? And the answer is not many of us in this room. I mean, we buy a loaf of bread for $3 and there may be 20 cents worth of wheat in it. The price of wheat doubles, or 40 cents worth of wheat in it. So it doesn't really make that much difference to us. But if you live in New Delhi and you go to the market and buy wheat, bring it home and grind up the wheat and make chapatis, if the world price of wheat doubles, the price of your chapatis double. So we're sort of isolated from this. And one of the things we're seeing emerge now in a number of low-income countries around the world is the concept of foodless days. I mean, we've been through periods where people realized they could only count on one meal a day. But now the increase in prices has been such that families now plan foodless days. In Nigeria, it's something like 24% of all families now routinely plan foodless days. That is, they'll get together on Sunday night and decide that they can only afford to eat 5 days during the week. So they'll skip Tuesday and Saturday. No eating at all. And this represents a deepening. We see this not only in Nigeria, but Ethiopia, India, Peru, Pakistan. It's becoming commonplace now. And I think it represents a new sort of deepening of the hunger crisis. This is an economic trend, but it has obvious social consequences. We're seeing, as a result of the tightening food supply, importing countries losing confidence in the world grain market and deciding they need to buy or lease land in other countries to make sure they have enough food for themselves. So we've had this, in the last few years, this land grab situation. The latest tabulation I've seen of the World Bank is that they were able to confirm, these are not just rumors, but confirmations of 396 land grabs around the world, land acquisitions, if you want to use a more publishable term. But the area of land involved is huge. It is equal to the wheat and corn land in the United States combined. So it's not trivial. These are very substantial areas of land now being claimed. And it's led me to think about the new sort of geopolitics of food scarcity. Because for most of the last half century, the big issue in international trade was always access to markets. It was the U.S., Canada, Australia getting together and hammering on Europeans and the Japanese to open their markets. And now suddenly, there's no problem with markets. You can sell anything you can produce. The problem is access to supplies. And when exporting countries of wheat like Russia and Argentina begin restricting or banning exports as a result of rising food prices, it creates a great deal of uncertainty in the world. Vietnam, the leading rice exporter, banned rice exports for several months. And suddenly importing countries realize that they have to begin looking out for themselves. So this is translated into these land acquisitions that we're seeing. And it seems to me to be a risky situation because it represents a sort of every country for itself mentality. I write in the book that food is the new oil, land is the new gold, and these resources have suddenly become very important. The International Index of Land Prices show land prices in the last few years climbing much faster. In fact, at double the rate of the Dow Jones Industrial Index. And I don't think this is the end. I think this is a process that's going to continue for some time. And the question is, why at this point in history are we seeing this transformation of the world food economy from one dominated by surpluses to one dominated by scarcity? And I would look first on the demand side of the equation. We are adding 80 million people a year. That's not new. That means there will be 219,000 people at the dinner table tonight who were not there last night. And tomorrow night there'll be another 219,000. So we're seeing a continuation of population growth. We're also seeing at the same time rising affluence, enabling probably 3 billion people in the world to move up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive livestock products. So we have population growth plus rising affluence. And just to put that in perspective, the average grain consumption per person in India today per year is about 400 pounds. When you only have a pound a day, you consume almost all of it directly. In the United States, we consume roughly 600 pounds of grain per person per year. And of that, we consume maybe 200 pounds directly in bread and breakfast cereals and so forth. Most of it we consume indirectly in the form of animal protein. So we have population growth and rising affluence. And now we have a third factor. And this has been particularly strong in the United States, though it's also a factor in Europe. And that is the use of food crops to produce fuel for cars. That is converting grain into ethanol. Last year, in the United States, we harvested 400 million tons of grain. Of that, 127 million tons went to ethanol distilleries to produce fuel for cars. In the last year, the use of grain to fuel cars has exceeded the use of grain to feed livestock and poultry. So those lines have crossed. So we have population growth, rising affluence, and the use of grain to fuel cars. And incidentally, that has led to roughly a doubling of the annual increase in grain consumption, measured in millions of tons, from roughly 21 million tons a year a decade ago to 41 million tons a year in the last few years. So demand has become much more robust than it was even a decade ago. At the same time, on the supply side, we have new trends emerging that are making it more difficult to expand production. One of these is water shortages. We're looking at we look at the big three grain producers, for example, China, India, and the United States. All three are now overpumping aquifers in order to expand production. In China, it is huge. In India, it is huge, much more serious than those two countries than in the United States. The World Bank estimates that 175 million people in India are now being fed with grain produced by overpumping. My estimate for China is that 130 million Chinese are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. And overpumping, I would remind you, is by definition a short-term phenomenon. So we have the overpumping of aquifers. We're running up huge water deficits in order to satisfy the current growth and demand. At some point, the aquifers begin to go dry. And when they do, the irrigation wells go dry. And we're now seeing that. We're seeing it in the Arab Middle East, for example, in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, in Syria. And these countries are turning now to the outside world for growing amounts of grain because their grain production is actually declining even as their populations continue to grow. So we have water shortages as a major constraint, and water deficits. Water deficits, like fiscal deficits, eventually have to be dealt with. In addition to tightening water supplies, we have rising temperatures. The rule of thumb is that for each 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature, there will be a 10% decline in grain yields. It turns out that some empirical study by a team at Stanford indicates that a 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature will lead to a 16% decline in grain yields. And that's based on real data for corn and soybeans in the United States. So we have rising temperature, and I would point out that agriculture as it exists today has evolved over an 11,000-year period of rather remarkable climate stability. There have been a few little blips here and there in the 13th or 14th century, the Little Ice Age, but basically we've had 11,000 years of rather stable climate. So agriculture as it exists today is designed to maximize production with that system, with that climate system. But that climate system is no more. Climate is now changing. And whereas agriculture and climate used to be in sync with each other, now with each passing year they're more and more out of sync. Farmers now on the land represent the first generation to face climate change. We've had weather adversity and fluctuations from year to year before, but not climate change, not since agriculture began. So this is a new challenge. A third challenge we face is soil erosion. We're seeing an overexpansion of agriculture, overplowing, and also, I would add, overgrazing. They're creating new dust bowls, huge dust bowls, one in northern China that's leading to a record number of dust storms each year now. Another huge dust storm forming in the Sahelian region of Africa, in Central Africa. This one is partly overplowing, but substantially overgrazing. But these dust bowls are growing, and there are no efforts in prospect that will contain them and keep them from expanding. So these are symptoms of a food system that's being overstressed. And the fourth thing that we're facing is one that is really sort of new in a sense, and that is if you look at rice yields in Japan or South Korea, or wheat yields in France or Germany or the UK, just to mention the three largest wheat producers in Europe, we see that yields in all of those countries have plateaued over the last decade. Wheat yields have not increased in France for 10 years now, after rising for decades. And in Japan, they've not increased for the last 15 years. So we're beginning to see yields in the more agriculturally advanced countries begin to hit this glass ceiling, which is really imposed by the efficiency of photosynthesis itself. Once you've eliminated all the constraints of nutrients and soil moisture and so forth, then photosynthesis eventually kicks in as the constraint on production. And no one that I know has any realistic prospect for altering or improving the process of photosynthesis. So we have on the supply side now a combination of water shortages, climate change, soil erosion, and in the most agriculturally advanced countries hitting the glass ceiling. All of these make it more difficult to expand world agricultural or world food production fast enough to keep up with the growth in demand. So my sense is that, we've all follow the trends of deforestation and soil erosion and aquifer depletion and overfishing and so forth. And we know that those trends cannot continue. But what will happen? What will be the trigger, if you will? And I think it's going to be food shortages. And if I were to pick one economic indicator that I think will tell us more about our future than any other, it would be grain prices. I think grain prices are already reflecting the imbalance that's developing between demand and supply. In terms of what we need to do, I think we now need to begin thinking about water productivity. We don't even have an indicator to measure water productivity. We know about land productivity. We've been measuring that for centuries. And we know what's happened in the last half century to land productivity. It has, for the world as a whole, grain yields have tripled from 1950 to the present. But how do we think about water productivity? How do we raise water productivity? It is water that is now emerging as the principal constraint on efforts to expand food production. There's a lot of land in the world that would produce food if we had water to go with it. So we need to think about raising water productivity, and there are a number of ways of doing that. We have to begin with irrigation, of course, because 80% of all the water we use in the world is for irrigation. The other 20% is for industrial and for household use. So one of the things we can do is to look at the various irrigation systems we use. They go from drip irrigation on one end of the spectrum through sprinkler irrigation and furrow or surface irrigation on the other end. We're probably not going to get drip irrigation on a large scale, but we do have sprinkler irrigation, and we're using it more and more now. So that's one thing we can do. Another thing we can do is begin to look at the water efficiency of various crops. It turns out that you can produce a ton of wheat with much less water than you can a ton of rice. Now, there are parts of the rice where rice is the only realistic option, parts of southern Asia, for example. But there are a lot of places in the world where you can grow either wheat or rice. And we need to keep in mind that we can produce a ton of wheat with probably half the water it takes to produce a ton of rice. So raising water productivity, I think, is going to be one of the real challenges in the years ahead. Another is how do we help stabilize population? And what we see when we look around the world is millions of women who want to plan their families but do not have access to family planning services. There's a huge gap there, and one that we need to fill. And it's not a costly thing to do. I mean, it takes about this much in thinking about global financial resources. The number is so small, it would get lost in the rounding of the U.S. defense budget, for example. So we need to think about this. And incidentally, I think at the heart of all this is a need to redefine security. We have inherited a definition of security from the last century, a century that was dominated by 2 world wars and a Cold War. So today, if you mention national security or security period, people think of the defense budget and more advanced weapon systems and so forth. But if I make a list of threats to our security today, climate change, spreading water shortages, population growth, rising food prices, growing political instability, armed aggression does not even make the top 5 in my list of threats to our future security. But we're still thinking as though international conflict is the big threat to our future. I don't think it is. I think it's water and population and climate change and food prices. I think these are the threats we have to deal with. So we're looking at raising water productivity. We're looking at filling the family planning gap to accelerate the shift to smaller families. And we've got to think about cutting carbon emissions. Not 80% by 2050, which is what political leaders like to talk about, present company excluded. But it's, now I've interrupted myself and lost my train of thought. Serves me right. We need to cut carbon emissions and cut them fast, not by 2050. Not 80% by 2050, but 80% by 2020. And that means restructuring the world energy economy and doing it fast. We can do it. I mean, I am one of the few people in the world who can remember World War II and the depression that preceded World War II. And what we saw in 1942 when the U.S. entered the war was a total restructuring of the U.S. industrial economy, not in years, but in a matter of months. And the reason it happened was because President Roosevelt banned the sale of cars. And when he did that, the automobile industry had no alternative but to produce tanks and planes. And they produced enormous numbers. I think Roosevelt laid out a goal in his State of the Union address at the beginning of January 1942. He said, we're going to produce 45,000 tanks, 60,000 planes, and so forth. And in the end, I mean, those numbers were beyond what most people could imagine. But in the end, we produced not 60,000 planes, but 129,000 planes. I mean, it was extraordinary the way the U.S. economy was restructured, totally restructured from making cars to making tanks and planes. Now, today, the challenge is to replace fossil fuels with renewable sources of energy. And it's not that difficult. I mean, we see 3 states in northern Germany now getting between 40 and 50% of their electricity from wind power. We see China launching a huge wind development program. Most of the world doesn't even know about it. But they're planning to develop 8 wind mega complexes, each of which will have at least 20,000 megawatts of wind generating capacity. 20,000 megawatts, just to put that in perspective, is 20 nuclear power plants. I mean, this is not trivial. The largest wind farm they have where they've begun development among these 8 is in Inner Mongolia. When it's completed, it will have 38,000 megawatts of generating capacity. That's enough to satisfy the needs of a country like Poland, for example. It is huge, just one huge wind farm. But we're beginning to see thinking that's responsive to the problems that we're facing. I could cite another one in the U.S., and here it's not so much the government as it is the Sierra Club that has launched a Beyond Coal campaign. And we have in the U.S., or we had 492 coal-fired power plants. They have now closed 121 of these, and their goal is to close every one. And they'll be replaced by wind and natural gas, gains in efficiency, and so forth. So we've got some things headed in the right direction. So when I think of energy, when I think of climate change, I think of the rapid transition from a world based on fossil fuels to one based on renewable sources of energy. One where we'll have electric cars instead of internal combustion engines. One where we'll have much more efficient public transportation. One where the bicycle will be playing a much more important role. And one of the most interesting things in the United States is that within just the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen 26 cities in the U.S. launch bike-sharing programs. And the next two will be, beyond that, will be Chicago and New York. So it's not just small towns. These are major cities in the U.S. beginning to in effect restructure the transportation system, because it's not just providing the bikes for bike sharing program, it's also creating a bicycle infrastructure, which is sort of take for granted in parts of Europe, but which doesn't really exist in the United States. So we're beginning to see signs of change, whether it's wind farms or bicycles or electric cars or what have you. And the technology is not a constraint. We can do the things we need to do with existing technologies. And my final point would be this. We're talking now about the future of civilization itself, because we're not going to see part of the world collapse and the rest survive. It doesn't work that way. We're all in this integrated world economy together now. So we've got to figure out how to turn this around. And it means not just recycling your newspapers and changing your light bulbs, though those are important. It means becoming politically active. Now, I'm probably preaching to the choir to some degree, just by the nature of a group that would assemble itself here in the European Parliament to focus on these issues. And saving civilization is not a spectator sport. We can't just sit around and hope someone else is going to stabilize climate before climate change spirals out of control. We have to do it. And we have to do it quickly. So this is the challenge. If you don't have a major issue to work on, pick one, whether it's cutting carbon emissions or working with international population groups or what have you, but or closing coal-fired power plants. But pick an issue and go to work on it. That's how change come. And the change is heading in the right direction, but we just need to move a lot faster now. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Lester, for your presentation. We put together facts we knew, we were not yet knowing, put in a larger picture, link it, and create out of it wake-up calls. You have agreed to be with us up to 20:30 here. Therefore, after the presentation, we are coming now to the interactive part of the evening. You have now the possibility to ask questions. Please, if you raise your arm, mention as well who you are. And afterwards, when we are leaving here, don't forget, there's a possibility, because Jocelyn, she writes a lot of books as well. She came because she likes you or loves you, I don't know. But she came with several bottles of champagne who are in a fridge already outside. Now, and those of you who would like to join Lester on bilateral meetings, we will go to the Bar London on the Luxembourg Square, drink your wonderful champagne, and eat whatever they have there in the Bar London. But now we are coming to the question time. You have been the first, then Cornelia, and then you. If you take always three together, and then the next one, and then Jonas.
Let me just suggest we start with the easy questions first.
Okay, good.
Thank you. My name is Lisette Van Vliet. I'm from the Health and Environment Alliance. I want to ask you a question which has two aspects to it.
And a little bit louder.
Sorry. I'd like to ask you a question that has two aspects to it. It's about the hydrological fracturing of shale rock for natural gas or unconventional gas drilling. And I'd like you to talk about not only its effect on energy supply, specifically my newspaper, The Guardian Weekly, which I've been subscribing to for many years, had a front page article on how it's completely changing American dependence on foreign oil, but also about the threats that it poses because of the chemical hazards getting into water supplies, which is another really important aspect of how it would affect our future water supplies.
Thank you very much, Lisette. The next is our journalist from China Daily.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Brown, for your presentation and your new book. Yes, I'm a journalist from China, but based in Brussels. Mr. Brown, as you know, in China we have a saying, people view food as heaven. So why the Chinese put the food to so high level? Because over the past 2,000 years, the food shortage happens from time to time. So for every Chinese government, how to use a lot of resources to deal with the food shortage. The last one, the last famine, just took place the last century in the 1959 to 1962. The tens of millions of people died because of hunger. Even when I was a child, I already knew the taste of hunger. So just in the last 30 years, it seems the food shortage is not a problem anymore. Because if you go to the Chinese restaurant in big cities, if you go to the supermarket, we have abundance of food. But Mr. Brown, what's your opinion? Do you think the Chinese food shortage is already resolved or not? The second one, your book, the subtitle is about new geopolitics. Can you see any weakness of China in this new geopolitics? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the third and the last in the first row is Cornelia Nauen.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. I have a question and a comment. I read recently a review that laid down some of the investments into, let's say, land grabs, food production and so on, down to liberalization of legislation in the U.S., which took away some of the previously imposed ceilings for transaction, and which have spelled out into massive increase in investment, which then, of course, have to generate, let's say, benefits for the banks, for the investors, and so on, and on a more or less stable basis, produced actually itself some increases in the food. Now, when you talk about the shortages, which clearly we can see in terms of access to food, when I compare that to the fact, or at least that what we're told, that in the US and in Europe, we may be destroying up to 40% of the food we produce before consuming it, I think these problems may not be solved only by producing more food, but that there is something else that is required in terms of how we do it, how we consume, and how markets and allocations are regulated in one way or another. So I would really appreciate your view on this wastage, which we have big time compared to the issue of scarcity elsewhere. And on the water, yes, we have made some global analysis on this, and it's very obvious that it's one of the big constraints. For China, for example, we did with Chinese scientists together an analysis of whether the water supplies in China would be sufficient to ensure food security in the long term, and none of the scenarios, even the most optimistic ones, would guarantee security, simply because of the population and greater affluence. So how trade, for example, can also help, if it's done under certain conditions, to alleviate some of the strain. It would be very interesting to hear your views about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. Now it's you, Lester.
On your point about 40% of food being wasted in Europe and the U.S., I don't know if the number is 30% or 40%. Both numbers are used, but there's a lot of waste. And one of the things that has occurred to me is that when we go to restaurants and we order a meal, the entree is always the same size. Whether we're big or little, we all get basically the same one, unless we happen to be a child. And I wonder if it might not make sense for restaurants to offer two sizes. You know, one if you're really hungry, and one if you don't really feel like you need a plate full of food. It's not that difficult to do, and it probably would save quite a bit, because all too often you end up with much more food on your plate in a restaurant than you really want to eat. And the only thing worse than leaving it on the plate is eating food you don't need. So maybe we need to rethink this a bit, and not think that one size fits everyone in all conditions. On the China question and water supplies and food security, as I mentioned earlier, it seems to me, it more than seems to me, it is the case that water is emerging as a major constraint on efforts to expand production, and that's in many parts of the world, not just in China. And so China is now faced with importing not only grain, but soybeans. 60% of all the soybeans entering world trade now go to China. One of the problems we have with soybeans is we're not good at raising soybean yields. So we get more soybeans by planting more soybeans. And largely, though not entirely because of China's appetite for soybeans, most of it for meal for livestock and poultry feed, one of the consequences of that is that in the Western Hemisphere, this has led to a restructuring of agriculture. In the Western Hemisphere, Canada through Argentina, there's now more land in soybeans than either wheat or corn. And I can remember as a youngster, if we saw a field of soybeans, we'd stop and look at it. It was such a novelty. Now, more land in soybeans than anything else in the U.S. down through Argentina. So the soybean issue is going to be a major issue for China and for the world, because we're not good at raising soybean yields. We just keep plowing more land. So that's a major issue for which we do not have an easy answer. On the land grabs and the massive increase in investment, the interesting thing is that it's very difficult to find among these 396 land grabs that the bank has documented, all of which are sizable. It's hard to find very much production, because a lot of these land grabs take place in Africa. And what you realize, or what you know if you know agriculture well, is that you cannot, I mean, getting land is just one stage in producing food. You have to have a supporting infrastructure for modern agriculture. You have to have grain elevators, for example. You have to have fuel or a grid, a source to power irrigation pumps. You need agricultural maintenance systems locally. Without them, you have a breakdown and you're in trouble. So I think we've assumed that land grabs are going to lead to dramatic increases in world grain production or world food production. They're not. They haven't yet, and it's going to be some time before they make a measurable impact. Remember, I don't think I'd be exaggerating to say that the annual increase in world grain production from land grabs is probably not more than 100,000 tons. But remember, the annual increase in world grain consumption is 41 million tons now. So we're not close to really making a difference in the world food balance as a result of land grabs, and I suspect it'll be some time before we do. On the question of hydrological fracturing and chemicals, the fact that the companies who are doing the the fracking will not reveal the chemicals they're using, I think is a pretty strong statement. And the reason they won't is because if people knew what chemicals are being used that are ending up in at least some cases in underground water supplies, I think fracking would come to an end rather quickly. So there's this concern. I think we need to keep the pressure on the companies. If they want to continue fracking, they at least have to tell us what chemicals they're using, and then let us decide based on that. So these are. I think I've covered most of the questions that were raised. The question in China whether food shortage is no longer a problem. China is now importing grain, and it's importing 80% of its soybeans. So it was, in 1995, China was self-sufficient in soybeans. Today it's importing huge quantities of soybeans and increasing quantities of grain, especially corn, for feed use as well. So that's another factor that is, as China goes from self-sufficiency to heavy dependence on imports, whether it's soybeans or corn or whatever, that contributes to the tightening of world food supplies and higher prices.
Thank you. We are coming to the next round. It's wonderful, great. First was Jonas, then you in the last row, and Dirk.
Let me suggest one question at a time. I sort of get.
Okay,
and,
good.
And let me respond briefly to each one.
Okay. Jonas, tell us who you are, and then.
Hi, I'm Jonas. I'm a student of environmental policy at Oxford University, and I have a quick question about the political engagement.
Where's Oxford?
Sorry, in the UK. Thank you.
Go ahead.
At any rate, I have a question about the political engagement that you called for. You know, you said in order to move things ahead, we need people to become engaged politically and so forth. But it seems to me that the main political hurdle that we have is the United States of America in so many ways, in terms of addressing climate change, in terms of reworking our energy infrastructure and all the rest of it. So without the United States moving, I see very little hope, to be honest, to get the change that we need. Now, can you give us a glimmer of hope? Do you think that there is a point where the United States could be pushed to move much more aggressively on those issues? And when do you think that point might come around?
That point has already come. When I mentioned that we have 492 coal-fired power plants, 121 of them have either just recently closed or are scheduled to close within the year. That's a major step in the right direction. But the goal of the Sierra Club, which is the organization that's managing this and coordinating all the other groups, both national and local, is to close every coal-fired power plant in the U.S. And I think they're going to do it. And the only question is how much longer it will take. But they're moving fast. And it's strong, and it has a lot of public support. People, if you someone did a poll, where would you like your electricity to come from? 4% opted for coal. Coal is not popular, so you have a strong public opinion against coal that makes it easier to do that. So the closing of coal-fired power plants in the U.S., I think, is along with the huge investment in wind farms in China, the two most promising trends in the effort to stabilize climate that I can see at the moment. The thing with oil is that in the U.S., one of President Obama's major contributions, which was in his last term, was we're slated to double the fuel efficiency of cars by 2025. But beyond that, the U.S. automobile fleet is itself beginning to shrink now because young people are not part of the car culture in the same way that my generation was, for example. So we're seeing a dramatic drop in coal use in the U.S., I mean really dramatic, and a substantial reduction each year now in oil use. So we're headed in the right direction.
No. In the last row, not you.
Thank you. My name is Hans. I work for a Belgian Green MEP. When you talk, Mr. Brown, when you talk about food shortages, also here in this House we are being told over and over again that there is a new technology, the green biotechnology, GMOs, that will fix this problem. Can you share your views on this? I'm sorry, I haven't read your book yet, but I will buy it.
The companies that are engaged in genetic modification like to talk about, doubling world food production by 2050 or whatever as a result of genetic modification. The reality is that we have done almost everything we can think of to raise grain yields, and we did those things with conventional agriculture, conventional plant breeding. It's not as though there's a long list of things that we can do to further raise grain yields or not. I mentioned the glass ceiling that a number of countries are now hitting. That glass ceiling is real. And I don't know of any country that's hit the glass ceiling that's been able to break free of it. And I don't expect there will be, because the principal constraint now is the process of photosynthesis itself. And I don't see anyone coming up with an alternative process that will convert solar energy into food energy more efficiently than photosynthesis does.
Next is Dirk Drieboms. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, welcome back, and thank you for keeping up the good work. I'm spending half of my time actually on a Greek island, which is called Paros. And there's a fierce discussion going on about introducing, because of course of the water shortage and the non-awareness of the importance of saving water and so on, I'm sorry to say. But I'm surprised you didn't mention, at least in your introduction, the effects of desalination techniques, which is something where a number of countries, coastal countries in particular, are hoping to find solutions. My second point is a more philosophical one. Do you think democracy is an obstacle to find urgent solutions to what you mentioned as major problems? Thank you.
The desalting is something we know how to do. And there are a number of cities, particularly coastal cities around the world, in the Middle East, but a few now in California and elsewhere, that are desalting seawater. The problem is that it's one thing to have, for homeowners who use very little water, actually, can afford that cost of desalting. But if you think about irrigating fields with desalting water, then suddenly the price of food multiplies several times. So it's not a realistic option for large-scale commercial crop irrigation. You might be able to do it with intensive, gardening of vegetables, for example, but not for producing wheat or corn, for example. On the democracy question, I think it was Churchill that said, democracy, I've forgotten the exact wording, but it doesn't seem like it works very well until you compare it with the options. And up until this point, at least, democracy has been the most effective way of organizing society and the most successful by a number of different criteria that one can think of. But whether or not democracy or dictatorship either will be able to solve the problems is I think a real question. I think if any system does succeed, I think it's more likely to be a democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Brown, for your presentation. Very logical. I followed and I learned a lot. My name is Edmund Jackson. I'm from the ACP Secretariat. And I have one particular question with regards to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that the figure that he used was 80% by 2020, which by all aspects it seems to be a revolutionary process as opposed to an evolutionary process. So I guess the first question would be how. The second thing is, do you think that developing countries as well as developed countries should be reducing their greenhouse gases to the same percentage, or will there be a differentiation between them? Thank you. Should there be?
The real question that we face now in development is, if we were to design an economy for the 21st century, what would it look like? It certainly won't be the economy we had in the 20th century. So if we start with a clean slate now and sort of design the economy, what would it look like? And it would be quite different. It would be, instead of high carbon, it would be low carbon. Instead of liberal use of water, it would be a much more efficient use of water. And one can go down the list. So it's not a question of industrial versus developing doing this. We're all in this together, and the ship is either going to float or it's going to sink. And so I think we in the industrial countries need to be both setting an example and helping the developing countries do the things that are in their interest. It's not going to be in their interest to build coal-fired power plants as the climate stresses intensify and climate panic sets in, for example. So it's not industrial versus developing. It's all of us together. And I think we in the industrial countries should be particularly concerned with setting an example of how to design and build an economy for the 21st century.
You, and then Carl, and then over there. Den Knopf neben dem Mikro.
Okay, thank you very much for the support. At first, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. My name is Hartmut Behrendt, and I'm working in SHAPE, NATO, where I'm working exactly on your subject, food insecurity and climate change. And my two short questions I have is, at first, if you compare desertification and climate change, which has the more severe impact on food insecurity? Because I'm asking because I saw the dramatic numbers of desertification rates which I read today in your book. The second question, I would like to come back to geopolitics and fracking. It has nothing directly to do with this subject, but concerning fracking, what is your estimation in terms of geopolitics, of the influence of fracking in the United States on Middle East OPEC countries, especially because they might be in a place of not being able to sell that amount of oil which they wished to sell. And the last short comment, I think we should not be that pessimistic for the future, because the last reports we saw from the Renewable Energy Agency, from the International Renewable Energy Agency, is that the amount of capacities for producing electricity, which is established on a yearly basis, 50% of this is by new renewables already, and 50% only by other electricity-producing media, and that the prices are going down. So this is a quite hopeful sign. Thank you. Okay.
On the question of desertification versus climate change, it's difficult to quantify. Partly because we don't know exactly what's going to be happening with climate change, but it looks as though climate change is contributing to desertification, and according to the most of the climate models will contribute to desertification in certain parts of the world, parts of the southwestern United States, for example. So it's hard for me to think in terms of desertification versus climate change, when climate change itself is one of the contributors to desertification. On the geopolitics of fracking, and the effect on Middle Eastern countries. The good news is that there are not that many countries in the Middle East. I mean, not that many people living in the Middle East. So it's not as though it was a huge chunk of humanity that was being affected by this. Most of the oil exports come from a few countries, a handful of countries that altogether have fewer than 100 million people out of a global population that's 70 times that size. So it is also the case, I think, that these countries have a fair amount of accumulated wealth that can be used to develop new industries and new ways of supporting themselves. So it is a challenge, but I don't think it's one of the big challenges that the world has to face.
Thank you, Lester. Now it's Carl Schlüter, MEP from Sweden.
Yes, thank you. Let me first just comment. You mentioned the economy in one of the earlier questions, and I think that's one of the keys. The traditional dilemma for humanity has always been to make resources into useful products to alleviate poverty and actually address material needs, and to increase that turnover rate has been the dilemma. And now we are rather facing the dilemma of resource scarcity rather than production capacity, and also then distribution of what is produced in a more fair way. So I think we need changes in the economic system to focus on non-material aspects of life growing rather than just the economy. I think that's an important part of the shift. But I have two questions for you, short ones, simple, easy ones to answer also. In your book also you talk about the relationship between food price and gasoline price, and the risk I see here is that the rich part of the world will always have a bigger economic potential to transform food into fuel than the poor parts of the world capacity to buy food. So what would be your policy recommendations to deal with that problem? My second question is, you mentioned that the productivity per hectare is plateauing for most things now in developed economies. And the fact, I think, is also not only plateauing, but since around 30% of the energy used in agriculture is actually fossil gas to produce fertilizers, and that will be more and more difficult to use fossil fuels to do that. So will we have a plateau, or will we actually might see a decline when the fossil prices are going up? So those are my two questions.
One of the key, in fact, the key indicator of productivity that we've been using for the last several generations now is labor productivity, how much we produce per person and how we increase that over time. But we are now in a situation where we need to also be thinking about resource productivity. Given the limitations on copper or water or what have you, how do we think about using them? And I've talked a bit about water. I haven't talked much about copper. I do remember several months ago reading in the, I think it was in the Telegraph, an analysis someone had done of copper in the UK. And as I recall, the National Telephone Telegraph Company, I can't remember the exact name now, owned, according to this guy's, its stock value was something like $10 billion. But it owned $60 billion worth of copper. Now, if you were smart, you would get some friends together and get control of that company and start pulling all those copper wires out, because they're really valuable now. You might also invest in a cell phone company to replace the phone lines and things that you would be pulling out. But the price of copper has really become very valuable. Now, I mean, in the States, there are a lot of wires being pulled down by thieves who are putting the copper on the market. On the fertilizer question, it takes energy to fix atmospheric nitrogen. I mean, one way of doing it is with soybeans. They fix nitrogen, but it takes a fair amount of their metabolic energy to fix that nitrogen, so you lose the yield there. Other legumes in rotation can help in the same way, reducing the need for fertilizer. The problem is that some of these legumes are alfalfa and things for hay and not necessarily things that we would eat directly. But we're going to have to rethink the structure of agriculture and its dependence on artificially fixed atmospheric nitrogen. It'll probably still be an important option, but there are other ways of thinking about agriculture in a world where fixing atmospheric nitrogen is going to be more and more costly.
Thank you. It was now over there, then Anna, and then Michel.
Miriam from the European Commission, but it's a personal question. You're suggesting a very quick shift to a low-carbon economy. And I was wondering, if you really force this, isn't there a risk that there is a shift towards much more nuclear power? And how could you avoid this?
When I try to evaluate a technology, one of the things I do is to look at Wall Street and see what Wall Street is doing. The interesting thing about nuclear power is I do not know of a single Wall Street investor that's invested in a nuclear reactor. And there's a reason for that. The economics just do not add up. And so if we could get by the economics, then we could seriously consider the issue. But we're not close to that point now, nor do I see any breakthrough in this area that will change this. So if we let the market guide us here without subsidies, nuclear is not really going to play an important role.
Next is Anna Atterson.
Hello. I work to empower the local community for sustainability, and much of this talk has been mainly about global solutions, and you've mentioned several times that we all sit in one boat. However, implicitly, you seem to be mentioning individual actors or groups of people a lot of the times as well. So I'm wondering, what is the relative importance of civil society versus international politics that, as we have seen in Rio Plus 20, seem to be in a major stalemate right now? Thank you.
You mentioned food and global solutions versus local solutions. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. The thing that impresses me in the States, or has impressed me in the last few years, has been the enormous increase in farmers markets that begins to link local production and local consumption again and provides the institutional basis for that. I'm trying to remember the number. I think we have opened in recent years something like 1,100 farmers markets in the United States. I mean, it's a pretty sizable undertaking, and it's not a process that's come to an end. It's still an ongoing process. And I think for a number of reasons. One, the quality of local, freshly produced food. Another, the energy costs of moving food long distances around the world are rising all the time, which reinforces the need for local agriculture. So I think there are a number of trends at work here that are reinforcing the move toward the localization of agriculture. Not that we can produce everything locally, but there's a lot that we can do that we're not now doing.
We are coming nearly to an end. It's now Michel Döring, and then you over there.
Thank you. Michel Döring from the European Press Club in Brussels. As you know, Mr. Brown, President Obama has been re-elected. We're very happy about that in Europe. In fact, if he had been re-elected in Europe, it would be 75% his approval rating on average. So, but I think in Europe there's also a lot of hope about his policies in his second term when it comes to the environment and whether he'll be more ambitious than during his first term, especially when there were the Copenhagen discussions where he didn't really show much leadership and Europeans were left pretty much on their own. So do you think already in Doha the Americans will be more assertive? And we'll see that in the next few days. And more generally, what is your view, what is the word on the street in Washington about the next administration? Thank you very much.
From a political point of view, it would have been difficult for President Obama to be reelected if he had taken an aggressive position on phasing out fossil fuels, for example, which is what we have to do if we're serious about climate change. But fortunately, the Sierra Club was doing much of the work for him on the coal issue. I mentioned closing 121 out of 492 coal plants. I mean, the Sierra Club is serious about this, and they're extraordinarily effective. And they're just going to keep going. So one of the things that's reinforcing the Sierra Club from the administration is Lisa Jackson at the Environmental Protection Agency, because she's beginning to press utilities with coal-fired power plants to bring them up to the cleanliness level, if you will, in terms of air pollution, of regulations already on the books. The Bush administration for 8 years never enforced any of these things and just let utilities do whatever they wanted to do. She's beginning to enforce those laws now, and that is providing a push for utilities to consider closing coal plants, an economic push, at the same time that the Sierra Club is mobilizing politically to close them. So the two are reinforcing each other. Another important thing that President Obama did, and it's not gotten a lot of attention, is to year by year increase the fuel efficiency of cars until by 2025 cars use only half as much gasoline as they do today, or fuel as they use today. That's an important step. The interesting thing is Detroit is 3 or 4 years ahead of that timetable that he's laid out, partly because of consumer interest. Car buyers today are interested in fuel efficiency in a way that we've never seen before. And it's not just because they're poor or because they're environmentalists. It's because people are thinking about energy use and climate change and having a level of an awareness that didn't exist even a few years ago. So he's done some things very quietly that haven't gotten much attention that are actually making a substantial difference.
My name is Petra Sieber. I work for Green Budget Europe and study at the University of Life Sciences, Vienna. My question is, we've talked a lot about food scarcity, which is only addressing to the amount we produce and whether we can supply all people with food. But I would like to know whether you also looked during your research on the concept of food sovereignty, which would consider more how we produce our food, how we distribute it, and how we can satisfy people's needs. Because we saw in the last decades, even when industrial agriculture was supposed to be successful, that even with a high yield, we couldn't distribute the food in a way that we could address people's needs. So maybe it would be more about changing the agricultural system than about maximizing the yield. Thanks.
We rely heavily on the market to distribute food. And the markets are very efficient and very, very productive in many ways. But one of the things they do not take into account is the equity question, or what's the minimum sort of amount of food that a person needs? I mean, we do it with government policies in the U.S. with food stamps, for example. We have now, I think, 42 million people on food stamps, for example, to make sure they get enough food. In looking at the global situation, the real challenge is to eradicate poverty. If we can eradicate poverty, we'll eradicate most of the malnutrition in the world. And it's doable, as economist Jeffrey Sachs has pointed out, and many others. For the first time in history, we have the resources to eradicate poverty. We do not have to assume that a good part of 1 billion people need to remain poor. So it's I think the way at getting not only at malnutrition, but also health care and education and a number of things is to focus on the equity of the economic system and to think about how we can help the market distribute resources in a more equitable, resources and services in a more equitable manner.
No, mes amis, despite that you would like to ask questions, we said in the beginning 8:30 is finito, but it's not really finito because those who would first like to have a signed copy of Lester Brown, please come here. You get a photo as well. And afterwards, those who would like to come are asked to join us in the restaurant London on the Luxembourg Square. Thank you very much that you came here, and thank you very much, Lester. You want to have a signed copy? Willst du eine kopieren? Du hast noch keine. Hier. Noch keine. Hier. Martin. Martin. M-A-R-T-I-N. Ja? Gut. So.